When lighting a scene like this, it's important to start with a clear creative direction. I made a separate video on how I developed that for this attic, and you can find a link to that within the description. From there, I built the lighting up one step at a time, starting in darkness. First, the natural light. In this case, that would be the moonlight coming in through the windows, along with the ambient light that comes along with it. Then the practical lights. These are any physical or artificial lights that exist within the environment. In this case, it would be the lamp that is sitting on the work desk. And finally, the artistic lights. You've already seen some of these in the natural and practical renders, as I included them in those passes, but we'll break them down a bit more in depth shortly. To simulate moonlight, I'm using a standard Maya directional light. Arnold doesn't include a dedicated one, but this works just fine. It'll give you access to Arnold's specific attributes within the attribute editor, as seen over here. Regarding the position of the light, I will typically move my directional or key light in regards to my natural lighting above the environment or the set so that I can easily see it and manipulate it when I need to. As for rotation, I dialed in things using the Arnold IPR within the viewport. Interactively adjusting the angle until I had something that felt believable helped to shape the scene and also guided the eye toward that focal point within the center of the frame. The light's angled from screen left, mimicking moonlight coming in through the window. The goal here was to light the space, not just the desk. I didn't want to be too on the nose. I also didn't want the moonlight to conflict in any way with the lamplight. For the intensity, I went with an intensity of 2 and an exposure of 3. Arnold's exposure operates in stops, so an intensity of 2 with an exposure of 3 will give you the equivalent of 2 times 2 to the power of 3, or an intensity of 16. Working in stops makes it quicker to dial in your values more precisely without having to work in a much larger intensity. For the light angle attribute, I settled on 1 for that. It's just enough to keep some soft edges on the shadows without losing too much shape from that light shape on the ground. And lastly, I disabled the light's volume contribution, made that 0. Since I created a separate light specifically for that one was rendered on its own render layer. I'll go over that setup later on. By getting the light in a good place like this early on, it really helps to set the tone for the rest of the setup. Again, not just lighting the subject, but the space itself. To add the ambient or indirect light, I used Arnold's dome light. It gave that soft global fill that I needed to lift the shadows without making them feel too bright or too dark. Now in the Arnold render view, here's a before and after comparison. On the left, we have just the directional moonlight that we went over previously. And then on the right, we have the dome light added. So again, we have the before and the after. I set the dome's intensity to 1.25 and the exposure to 1. Now, these values were chosen essentially through trial and error while also checking my reference along the way. For the dome color, I used a lighter, more desaturated blue than the directional light. And that gave me the silver blue tone that I was aiming for and avoided overly blue shadows as well. Now, one challenge I faced was that the dome was lighting the inside edge of the circular window above the desk, and it was just too bright. Now, since the directional light was coming from screen left and behind the camera, it just didn't make sense that the window would appear so bright. It felt like a strong light source was just like right outside the window. So to fix this, I duplicated the dome light, I reduced its intensity to 0.007, and then I unlinked it from everything and then relinked it to just the window. I then unlinked the original dome from just that window. This gave me isolated control, but it also meant that the original dome no longer cast shadows from the window, so more light spilled into the attic than intended. The result felt more believable to me, but the window felt slightly pasted on since the duplicated dome inversely didn't cast shadows from anything but the window and effectively bypassed the environment and uniformly lit the window. Now, one fix would have been to lower the window dome's intensity a bit further even. A better approach, though, would have been using portal lights by placing one outside of each of the windows to guide the dome light in naturally. That method would keep the shadows intact, reduce noise, and create overall a more realistic result. So I rendered a version with the portal lights turned on, and so we have them on and off. Here's the before and after. And so as you can see, the portal light version does look more realistic and integrated. Still, to keep things simple, since it was just one frame, I stuck with a duplicate dome and used a denoise imager to clean up the final result. In production, I would typically use portal lights or sometimes area lights to push the outside light through the openings or the windows. Regardless, this workaround still held up once I added the lamplight and applied the final compositing. Now, if I were to redo it, I'd probably use portal lights, hindsight 2020. I could have also reduced the specular weight on the window material to soften highlights. That is a valid tweak, but ideally, lighting should behave correctly without relying on any type of material fixes. With that said though, with all of these adjustments in place, the lighting was balanced, the directional lighting was providing structure and focus, while the dome filled the space and unified the scene. To build on the mood and add a bit more character, I introduced a moon bounce light. To create this, I made an area light and placed it just outside of the screen left window and angled it to match the same direction as the directional moonlight. The idea here was to spill a bit of soft, diffused light into the space, mainly around the pool of light that was already being cast on the floor by the directional light. You can see some of its influence on the floor, but also a little bit on the desk, the nearby wall, as well as the door. So here's the before and after where you can see just that. So here we have a render of just the dome light and the directional, and then here's the after with the bounce light added. So as you can see, it's helping to soften the contrast within the area. It also made the lighting feel a bit more lived in, like the moonlight had some more presence within the room. It's also adding a bit more visual weight and brightness in the center of the frame, which helped to guide the viewer's eye. To introduce the first and only practical light in the scene, I placed a mesh light inside the table lamp using a simple sphere positioned within the lamp model to act as the visible light source. Here's a before and after comparison of what the scene looks like, first with just the natural lighting setup, and then with the lamp light added. Now, when I first opened the scene, there was already an emissive sphere present, but technically it wasn't a true mesh light per se. Instead of being created through the Arnold shelf, its shape node had the Arnold translator set to mesh light underneath of the Arnold dropdown. Now, that setup can work in many cases, and it probably would have worked fine here too, but it doesn't give you quite as much flexibility if need be down the line. This is because no actual light object is created in the outliner, so you're essentially just making it emit light as if it had an emissive material with slightly more controls. For example, you can't use light linking in this case, which might limit your ability to fine-tune lighting interactions within the environment. And since no real light node is created, it also won't show up in the light editor, which makes managing and adjusting lights harder in more complex scenes especially. So instead, I created a proper mesh light by selecting the sphere and clicking the mesh light button from the Arnold shelf. This generates an actual light node tied to the mesh and gives you all of the standard Arnold light attributes, including the ability to light link if needed. Sometimes I'll even use both a mesh light and a standard area light together. That way the mesh light handles the visible practical, and the area light gives you more flexibility for shaping and directing light into the environment. But for this scene, I kept it simple and went with just the mesh light. This gave me the localized effect that I was after. It also helped anchor the practical light source visually within the scene. A subtle rim light was then added, coming from the direction of the lamp, acting more like a localized accent light than anything major. Now, depending on the context of the shot, if it was a reverse angle, this could double potentially as a subtle fill light if the angle were reversed. This was just to add just some slight value variation in the foreground and help to pull the viewer into the space just a little bit more. It's not meant to be a rim light for any subject within the scene, and it's definitely not a hero light. It's more of a soft environmental accent light, adding just enough presence to create depth and texture without drawing attention. When adding lights like this, subtlety is key. Too much intensity and it starts to look unnatural, especially since it isn't clearly motivated by a visible source. To create it, I used an Arnold area light, scaled it slightly on the y-axis and then by quite a bit more along the width, just to make sure that it was affecting all of the objects within the frame. The spread was set to 1, which helped keep the falloff soft and localized to the foreground area without needing any light linking. I then color matched it by eye to the practical lamplight and landed on an intensity of 1 and an exposure of 12. I generally try to stick to consistent exposure values across shots. It just helps to keep things more organized, especially within any kind of production scenario. But during early look dev, I'll often just dial in whatever works visually and then adjust it from there to kind of just get that result a little bit quicker. This kind of light is definitely a take it or leave it detail, but in this case, it added just enough separation and visual polish that I decided to keep it. Next, I added a skip light near the lamp. I created this using an Arnold disc area light. It was positioned just in front of the desk and over the rug. In hindsight, I probably would have unlinked it from the rug since you can see it affecting the area a bit too clearly. The goal wasn't to light the rug specifically, but rather to pick up subtle highlights on nearby specular surfaces within the environment. By doing this, it helped to accentuate the leading lines, add depth, and draw the viewer in. That's really what a skip light is for. It's typically used to skip the light across the surface and bring out specular highlights and add separation without directly lighting the object or the subject. Either that, or I might have skipped it altogether. No pun intended. It's definitely another take it or leave it light in this type of context. The mesh light inside the lamp was already doing a decent job affecting the environment and giving us some nice warm to cool contrast as well. But looking at it side by side, the skip light was subtle enough that I felt it wasn't breaking anything, so I decided to keep it. To finish off the lighting, I added subtle volumetrics by scaling a volume cube to cover the attic. I assigned an AI volume shader and set the density to 0.001. To get it working, I plugged the shader's out color into both the surface and volume shader inputs. This avoids the green viewport display, essentially making sure it displays properly within the viewport and ensures proper rendering. Just a quick tip, you could also go to the Shape tab for the volume box, then go to the Object Display, Drawing Overrides drop down, and then change the level of detail setting to Bounding Box. This way it will still be renderable, but just display a wireframe in the viewport. This makes working in the scene much easier since it's not obstructing your perspective view as you're navigating around. Once placed, the lights naturally interacted with it. I kept it subtle, just enough to add fall off without making the attic look smoky. The intended use was that the ambient dome light would be the only light affecting the volume box on the main scene layer or beauty pass. And this is what that looks like. To do this, I reduced the volume contribution for the visibility stats on all of the lights down to 0, except for the primary ambient dome light within the scene. For more control, I made 3 render layers. Volume window direct pass or directional, volume window ambient pass, and then the volume lamp pass. Each layer enabled the vol lights group within the outliner that you can see here and hid all non-relevant volumetric lights, leaving only the light I wanted active per pass. I achieved this just with a few overrides. To isolate the volumetrics on each of those respective layers, I applied an AI utility matte override to the set geometry. So essentially a black surface shader without any, you guessed it, shading. Then I added a white color override to the active volume light per layer. This gave me clean passes that I could treat like masks within comp, making it easy to dial in the look, color, and diffusion later on. Now, the reason that I duplicated the original lights and created these volumetric versions of them is because within Arnold, you can't create an absolute override, the volume contribution for the visibility. If you could, I probably would have just turned it to 0 on the main scene layer and then set an absolute override, turning it to 1 on each of the corresponding volumetric render layers for each light that I was looking to get a result from. That being said, this setup did work just fine at the end of the day. It kept things reasonably clean and gave me enough control to achieve the final result that I was going for. Another approach to separate your volumetrics out into groups is by using the RGB channels. You'd start by coloring each light either red or green, or a blue. Then you would assign them to a single render layer. This method keeps things a bit more streamlined. It's just one render layer, one comp input. It's faster to manage and easier to grade. Then in comp, you would separate out your red, your green, and your blue channels to control each light independently, whether adjusting your intensity or your color. That being said, for this scene, the separate render layer approach for each light gave me a clean, clear setup that gave me enough control to get the job done. The final step in the lighting process was setting up the depth of field that we can see here on the foreground objects. To get the correct focal distance, I switched to the top orthographic camera view. Then I went to Create, Measuring Tools, and then I selected the Distance tool. Using that, I clicked on the camera's position, and then on the object I wanted in focus. In this case, again, it was the work desk. That gave me the precise distance between them. That general value did the trick here in this case, and so I entered that into the focus distance field in the Arnold camera settings and set the aperture size to 2 to get a nice, subtle, soft blur on the foreground. And that's it. That wraps up the process for this scene. If you found it helpful, I hope you did. Feel free to like and subscribe.